Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I'm going to be discussing my TBR for the rest of the year for 2021. I've sort of decided to split the rest of the months, October, November, and December, into different genres, separate them by genres, because already in October, I was planning to read a bunch of horror books, and then in November, there's a few fantasy books that I was already going to read, so for November, I just decided to make that fantasy. And then in December, I wanted to do sci-fi. So October is going to be spooky season, November is fantasy, and December is sci-fi. And then there's a little bit of mishmash here and there, but that's generally what it is. And I'm basically just going to go over all the books that I plan on reading for the rest of the year. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So even though October is going to be spooky season, lots of horror books, there are two fantasy books that are last books in a series that I want to wrap up. City of Miracles by Robert Jackson Bennett. I'm currently reading the second book, City of Blades, and I'm loving it. And I'm hoping to get to this one in October to finish that trilogy up. Kind of the same thing with Michael J. Sullivan, the Rhaenyra Revelations. This is the third book. I'm going to be reading the second book this month, and then hopefully I can jump right into the third book in October. And then we have the spooky, scary stuff. Speaking of Robert Jackson Bennett, we have, we have Mr. Shivers, which for those who don't know, Robert Jackson Bennett was originally a horror writer before he wrote fantasy. And I found this at a used bookstore the other day, and I was like, oh, that's a pretty cool find. So I'm going to jump into this blind and just see how his writing style compares to his fantasy. I think that'll be very interesting. Let's go ahead and talk about Stephen Graham Jones. I've been really enjoying Stephen Graham Jones this year. He's the new favorite horror writer for me. And one of the books I'm going to read is The Last Final Girl. I'm going to be buddy reading this with Evie from She Was Only Evie. And this one's going to be interesting because we just read My Heart is a Chainsaw, which deals with the final girl trope, and this is literally called The Last Final Girl, so I don't know really what to expect, and this was written before that one, so that'll be interesting to see what that's about. Also, Stephen Graham Jones, Zombie Bake Off, and this just is a nice short book, should be a nice palate cleanser, and I'm assuming it's going to be really fun. But Stephen Graham Jones is going to throw some kind of weird twist on the genre of zombie bake-offs, so that'll be fun. This is a bit of a departure for me. I don't typically read classics. I do enjoy a few of them, but typically I read newer books or semi-newer books. But I'm going to be reading Crime and Punishment, Christie from Dostoevsky. I can't pronounce that name. Dostoevsky in Space, Christie. She convinced me and a bunch of other people to read this in October. And apparently it's about an axe murderer. So that's pretty fitting for spooky season. Apparently it's pretty digestible for a classic. So I am also excited for that one. And trying to see, the rest of these are all rereads for me. So I'm going to go ahead and say what I'm most excited to reread, which would be Imaginary Friend, which is a top 10 book for me of all time, one of my all-time favorite horror books. I read this earlier this year, and I'm very excited to reread it with a bunch of people in Gregory LaPerch's Discord server. I think they made their own horror book club, and I just on a whim, I just said, hey, I nominate this book, and it won. And I kind of feel bad because it's 700 pages, and That's a lot of pages to dedicate for a book club. But I read this book extremely fast. I read this book in 3 pages, so hopefully a lot of people enjoy it as well. I certainly did. And there's a couple of Ray Bradbury books. I love Ray Bradbury. He's one of my all-time favorite authors. And for October, The October Country is very fitting. One of his all-time best short story collections. It's less sci-fi-y, more kind of on the horror side. So this is one of his best. And then, of course, The Halloween Tree, which is a very short, almost kind of like children's book. And so I'll be probably reading this on Halloween. Also, we have the 3rd book in one of my all-time favorite series, the John Cleaver series, I Don't Want to Kill You by Dan Wells. And like I said, this is the John Cleaver series, and it's a 6-book series kind of split into 2 trilogies. So this is the last book in the first trilogy. It's so good. It's about this sociopathic teenager who, it's kind of like Dexter, where he sets these rules so he doesn't get tempted to want to murder someone. But then in the first book, when a series of murders starts happening in his small town, he gets very intrigued by that, and then it just goes from there. This is the 3rd book, and I'll be reading Mr. Monster, book 2, this month. So, I think that's it. And then 2 books that I would probably put in my top 20-ish books of all time. Definitely this one, Baby Teeth by Zoe Stage. It's a reread for me, one of my all-time favorite books. Again, about a sociopathic child, although this is a 7-year-old girl who's basically trying to kill her mom, and it's so entertaining. And you get the dual perspective of the mom trying to deal with this little crazy girl, and then you get the perspective of the little crazy girl scheming, planning on what she's going to do to potentially kill her mom. And it's just so much fun, and I want more people to read Zoe Stage. And then the last book for October is a very short but very creepy book called The Grip of It by Jacques Jemk. Honestly, this is probably the creepiest book I've ever read. Misery is the scariest, but this is just very unsettling and very, very eerie. It's very fever dreamish, and it's written in a way, it's a very short book, and there's like 100 chapters, and you're constantly flipping back and forth of these very small chapters of the husband and the wife. And by doing that, she really unsettles you because you're not really sure who's telling the truth. You're not really sure what exactly is real and what's going on and what isn't. It's, it starts off like, oh, it's just a haunted house story, but then it gets really weird, and it's very unsettling, and one of my all-time favorite horror novels. So that's it for October. Now we're going to get into November right now. So for my November TBR, I'm going to go ahead and mention one book that I don't currently own, but I do have the audiobook for, and that would be The Mask of Mirrors. I can't remember who the author is. I think it's an author duo, and one of them is Marie Brennan. But that audiobook, or that book in general, just sounds really intriguing. And I know Leslie from The Nerdy Narrative and a bunch of other people, they love that book. Kate from The Literary Apothecary, they love the book, and honestly, I really don't know too much about it, but I'm going to go in and hopefully love it. Another book that I don't own is the sequel to The Bone Shard Daughter, which comes out in November. So for November, I'm going to be rereading The Bone Shard Daughter, which is one of my favorite fantasy debuts of all time. And then, hopefully try to time it out where I read this right before The Bone Shard Emperor comes out, and I'll read both of those. And hopefully that one's good. And like I said, November is just full of fantasy books, with a couple exceptions. So one of them is Beneath the Twisted Tree by Bradley P. Bulio. This is the 4th book in the Songs of Shattered Sand series. Again, one of my all-time favorite fantasy series. I reread the first two books for the Olympics readathon, and I recently read the third book for the first time and very much loved it. And I'm hoping that as I continue through the 6-book series, that it just gets, if not better and better, hopefully it stays consistently good. Also, we have a George R. R. Martin book, not A Song of Ice and Fire, but a standalone book called Windhaven, which, which he co-wrote with Lisa Tuttle back in the early 80s. And like I said, this is a standalone fantasy novel, and I'm pretty sure it's about these people. First of all, the setting, let me mention the setting. The map is very interesting. A lot of the times you get fantasy maps, and there's just a bunch of land and a bunch of mountains and forests. This is basically like an archipelago of islands, and which is a very cool setting. And so I think it makes sense that these people build these giant wings that they basically use to fly, I guess, between the different islands. And so that'll be very interesting to read. I'm kind of mad that I haven't read this because George R. R. Martin is my favorite author. So I probably should have read it by now, but I'm going to get to it in November, hopefully. And let's talk about some more fantasy books. This will make Sharon Dwyer very happy. I'm going to read Traitor's Blade by Sebastian de Castell. I've heard pretty much nothing but great things about the Greatcoat series, although the first book is supposed to be the weakest, so if I'm not like madly in love with it, I'm still probably going to continue with it, but hopefully I at least enjoy it for what it is. And then a book that I've also heard nothing but great things about is The Ninth Reign by Jen Williams, which is the first book in the Willowing Flame trilogy. And this book is supposed to be very weird, very kind of all over the place, and very atypical fantasy, which I typically love fantasy books that are a little on the weirder side, so I think I'm really going to enjoy this one as well. Also, speaking of Robert Jackson Bennett, I'm reading, the Divine Cities trilogy, and I'm hopefully going to jump into Foundry Side, which is his newest series. This is the first book in the trilogy. The second book is Shorefall, and then apparently the third book has finally been announced. So hopefully I'll enjoy this, enjoy Shorefall, and then next year jump right into the third book. And I'm going to be also reading the sequel to Kings of the Wild, Bloody Rose. I believe Kate from the Literary Apothecary is having a read-along and a live show dedicated to this book. So I'm very interested in finally getting to this book, because it's been a hot minute since I've read Kings of the Wild, and I've heard a lot of great things about this book. I've heard Andrew from Andrew's Wizardly Reads says that he prefers the first book to the second book, but what does he know? just kidding, Andrew. I'm very excited for this book. And then a couple of non-fantasy books is going to be, like I mentioned, the John Cleaver series. I'm going to be starting the fourth book, The Devil's Only Friend, which is the start of the second trilogy. Someone's making a lot of noise back there. Anyway, like I said, it's the fourth book, and the second trilogy isn't quite as good as the first trilogy, but it's still good nonetheless. And I really love Dan Wells' writing style, especially with this series, and I love John Cleaver as a character. So I'm going to be making my way through that series. And then a book that I'm going to be rereading for probably the 6th or 7th time at this point in my life is Drums, Girls, and Dangerous Pie, which is a top 5 book for me of all time. It's a middle school book that I read back in middle school, and I've read it at different stages in my life, and I'm going to reread it again in November, probably right around my birthday. It's a very quick read, and obviously it's a middle school read, so all of the words are super big, so it takes a couple hours to get through, but I'm also very excited to reread this book. And that is November. Now we got to jump into December, right? So if October is more on the horror side and November is more on the fantasy side, for December, a lot of these books are sort of sci-fi or sci-fi adjacent, and then some of them, well, yeah, most, we'll go with that. I don't feel like editing this video. Editing. We're gonna go with Ray Bradbury, The Illustrated Man, a top 10 book, possibly a top 5 book, probably my all-time favorite short story collection. There's 18 or 19 short stories in here, and they're all terrific. They're all very well written. Ray Bradbury is my all-time favorite short story writer, and it's been a while since I've read this, so I'm going to jump into this book and hopefully enjoy it just as much as I think I've read this book 2 times. I don't know. But speaking of George R. R. Martin, also, he has a book that he wrote, or co-wrote really, with a bunch of authors, with Gardner Dozois and Daniel Abraham, which he's more famous for writing the oh god, what is what is that series called? It's one of Alan's favorite series. I can't remember. It's like Price of Spring. Oh god, I don't know, but he's written some fantasy, and they all, basically the story behind this book is, I think George basically started writing this book with Gardner Dozois, and they couldn't really figure out how to make it work, and then Abraham kind of stepped in to kind of finish it off, like years later. Like, I think they started writing this in the 70s. I could be getting that wrong. But this is the final product, which I think came out in like the mid-2000s. So I'm going to jump into this and see what it's all about. Also, Michael Crichton, I've read most of his books, except for Timeline, which is all about time travel. And I do like time travel, but the reason I like Michael Crichton is that his books are at least somewhat believable most of the times, where he takes these scientific phenomenon and spins them into an exciting thriller tale. But with this one, like, time travel feels more like of a fantasy idea, or at least not a fantasy, but like a fantastical idea, where it's going to be kind of hard for him to come up with a scientific explanation that's like credible. But, you know, if he does that, that's pretty cool. I know a lot of people enjoy this book. My good friend Joanna loves this book. She loves time travel. So I'm going to hopefully enjoy this book as well. And then, speaking of Dan Wells, yet again, we have book 5 of the John Cleaver series, Over Your Dead Body. And honestly, this is the book that I remember the least about. Every other book, I at least remember like the general premise or like a specific scene. With this one, I have a really hard time remembering what happens in this book, so this book will hopefully be a nice refresher for me. And then this next book is sort of a blend between fantasy and sci-fi, and that would be The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. I think I've tried reading this book a few years ago, and I couldn't get into it. I think I read like the first 3 or 4 chapters, and I wasn't vibing with it. But a lot of people say that it's amazing, so I'm going to try to get into it, and hopefully I love it. I don't know. Again, I'm not editing this, so whatever. A book that I am really excited for, though, is Vengeful by V.E. Schwab, which is the sequel to Vicious, which I read last month or a few months ago. Either way, it's a fantastic book. I sped through that book, and I read it in basically like a 24-hour sitting. And this is the sequel, and I'm very, very excited for it. And honestly, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen in this book, but if it's at all like the first book, it's going to be extremely fast-paced, it's going to be very entertaining, and I'm going to love it. Also, we have another sequel that I was supposed to read, I think for the Olympics readathon, but never did. So I'm going to read it in December. That would be A Desolation Called Peace by Arcada Martine. This is the sequel to A Memory Called Empire, which I very much enjoyed. It's like a 4.5-star read for me. I loved the world building in that book and just the philosophizing that's a weird word to say. The philosophy in that book and just the culture clashes and even like stuff like the naming system, like how they named people and things. Very interesting read. This book is supposed to be more action-packed, so I don't know if I'll like it as much, but we'll see. And then we have a couple more here. We have Octavia Butler, Wildseed. Now, I've tried to read Parable of the... Or actually, I did read Parable of the Sower last year, I think, and that was okay. It's like a 3-star read. But apparently this book is supposed to be a little bit more entertaining and a little bit more on the interesting side. So I'm hoping to really get into this one. We also have Exhalation by Ted Chiang. And I've already mentioned that I love Ray Bradbury's short stories, and this is supposed to be a great modern sci-fi short story collection. Again, I've heard nothing but great things about this one in particular. I wish I had a different copy because I really hate deckled edges. I don't know if I can... Oh, God. That's one of my biggest bookish pet peeves is friggin' deckled edges. I need to probably just go buy the paperback copy because deckled edges. And then there's a couple of books that I don't currently own that I want to read in December, including The Bear and the Nightingale. I don't remember who the author is, but it's the first book in the Winter Night trilogy. Evie from She Was Only Evie is doing a read-along for that entire trilogy during December, January, and February. She's read it already, and it's one of her favorites. A bunch of people have. I've never read it before, so I'm very interested to see what I think of it. And then there's another book I was going to read in December that I don't own. Oh, yeah. The Dark That Dwells, which was the pick for the Shelf Space Book Club in August, I believe. I think. Again, I'm not going to double check this or edit it, whatever. But I heard the premise for that, and I heard kind of like the non-spoilery talk on the live show about it, and it sounds amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up a copy of that and hopefully get to that in December as well. But pretty much those are the books for December, and those are the books for the rest of the year in general. Now, of course, I'm not going to make it very rigid and very strict that I'm going to read all of these books and no other books because, things change. My tastes change. They're always evolving. And I also have Book of the Month. If I do find some Book of the Month Club picks that look intriguing to me, I will be adding those and then maybe subtracting something. Or, my birthday is in November, so I'm sure I'll be getting some gift cards from family members, and I'll be buying a bunch of books that I don't need, but that I want. So I'm sure that'll add to the equation as well. But generally, these are the books that I want to go ahead and try to finish in 2021. Yep. And please let me know what you thought of this video. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, whether you loved them or whether you hated them. Please tell me why down in the comments. Or on the flip side, if you're interested in reading in any of these books, if you're interested in reading any of these books, please let me know all of that down in the comments below. And of course, if you're... Apparently, I can't remember how my outro goes. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day.